I've mentioned plenty of times that future bass is my favorite musical genre. I've even talked about it twice, once in a video stating I would try to revive it within 5 years, and once in my first video about EDM genres. What I haven't done is explain exactly why future bass is my favorite genre, so here's your explanation. Future bass covers a wide range of motions that can fit in almost every setting. I think next to house and dubstep, it's one of the most varied genres in EDM. To further explain this, I'm going to break down how to make future bass and give some of my favorite defining features of the genre. Firstly, future bass's most obvious trait is the use of supersaw synths. What do I mean by this? Basically, a sawtooth synth is a sound wave that plays a very sharp triangle pattern. When a speaker moves, its peaks, when it wobbles back and forth, are very sharp and very quick. A supersaw is when a lot of those sawtooth waves play at the same time, but at different starting intervals. They can be detuned or fine-tuned. But generally, a supersaw is defined by this kind of synth. You will often hear this kind of synth be used with low passes and reverb to make soft pads for the off-drop sections of songs. But you will also hear this kind of synth used for powerful chords in the middle of drops, usually without the low pass filter, but sometimes with varying levels of reverb. What really changed the game with future bass was the implementation of a low frequency oscillator, or LFO. I talked about this before, but just as a refresher, an LFO basically can change the volume levels of the synths in certain very obvious patterns. It's called a low frequency oscillator because sound waves always oscillate at a high frequency, but this pattern allows a much more obvious sound effect to be heard. This LFO doesn't always have to be put on the volume. It can be placed on the compression, distortion, filter, and waveform to change any number of parameters within a synth. The most common is, of course, the volume, but keep this in mind because not all future bass needs it. You may think that all future bass needs heavy LFO usage on the volume to keep the genre's iconic sound, but there are very notable acts that don't use it too frequently for volume, like Illenium and Set the Sky. Of course, most future bass musicians do use the LFO tool to modulate the volume, such as Conroe and Karma Fields. Typically, when talking about chords for this genre, I'm gonna be honest, you can use whatever kind of chords you want. Now, obviously, put some thought into it, don't just spam random notes, but as I mentioned before, future bass covers a wide range of emotions, from sad to happy, and you can incorporate any kind of chord progressions depending on mood. Now, the second most important part about future bass is the drums. I mentioned before that future bass takes its drum influences from trap, which is correct. It does end up using plenty of drums and typical drum patterns from trap, but what future bass innovated on by incorporating dubstep elements and new sound design is the introduction of shifted and tonal snares.
Where are you now that I need you?
Tonal snares are usually made using a synth sound and basically messing with parameters to give it a certain pitch. Then you would match that with a pretty tight, unpitched clap or already existing snare sound. Shifted snares are made by usually matching two snares, sometimes with a pitch, sometimes without, and lining them slightly off from one another. This can create a very tight yet impactful snare that cuts through the mix well, especially with good sidechaining. As for kicks, most kicks are usually adopted from dubstep, pop, or trap, and only really have some slight differences. I would guess the reason for not really being known for more creative kicks is because 1, don't complicate something that's already pretty simple, and 2, different kicks with different thicknesses can match certain vibes for certain songs. From here on out, though, much of future bass is determined by sound design and styles, which is literally impossible to generalize, so I'll have to give some more in-depth explanations of some very notable styles. I think the most approachable style for future bass for a beginner to make would be the Illenium style, in which you only need 1 or 2 types of snares and kicks, a simple chord progression, very simple sidechaining, and a basic understanding of how to sidechain. Typically, Illenium's drum patterns are very obvious, usually sounding like this. You'll notice he makes liberal use of a reverse kick to make the next one hit much harder. Most Illenium snares are very white noisy, but have a tonal, hard first hit that usually carries on and dies down. His synths follow very easy to predict yet powerful chords like this. It's important to note that the synth hits usually occur almost exclusively in tandem with the drums. They work with one another to drive the song. And he usually makes liberal use of heavy sidechaining to break the monotony of the chords. There is usually very minimal chopping or LFO use otherwise. On top of all of this, you really just need to find some vocals or vocal chops to put on top like so. And there you go, that's a very simplified way of making Illenium style. Another notable style is the commercial style. I call it that because a lot of commercially viable songs feature this kind of style. The synths can vary in complexity, but they usually make heavy use of the LFO tool and focus on the intricacies it provides. With this style, we will actually start using more tonal and shifted snares in patterns that can honestly vary quite a lot. This style will also benefit from little fills in between synth-heavy sections of the drop. These fills can include drums, sound effects, or other kind of synth sounds to break the monotony. Vocals and vocal chops are very important here too. Most of the time when vocals are included, they are usually just as cheesy as pop songs, but most people aren't concerned about that and are really focused on how well you can make these vocals fit into the mix with different effects and chops. If you can put these elements together, you can make this genre.
Darling, you want to know what I think?
Chill. I mean, we just trying to chill.
Now, this is a wide variety of styles that I've tried to simplify, so here are some other examples of songs that I would put into this style.
to share that. I could be your home, I could be your everyday. I could give you warmth, even if I'm feeling cold, my dear. I could be your
Another distinct style is what I would call traditional future bass. This style is very indicative of the earliest days of future bass, which put an emphasis on the LFO tool. Chords were usually quite simple, and vocals were usually limited to vocal chops, even though quite a lot of newer songs that make use of this style incorporate them. The drum patterns usually are almost the same as the previous style, but this time some of the drums will act as fills when synths are absent.
This is the beginning of meditation.
The synths may also feature some low-pass action to help push the rhythm, like so. Most of the intricacy here is derived from the use of the LFO tool, but you still need to know what sounds appropriate for what you're trying to do with the song, which is why I would consider this style a bit less approachable. You can also add some intricacy with vocal chops and some other kinds of synth fills and arpeggios. I know from personal experience tackling this style that it's pretty hard to do without sounding like someone else, or maybe I'm just doing it wrong. Regardless, since I don't have any examples of my own music, here are some examples of what I mean when I call this style traditional. This next style I like to call the Monstercat style. It's a style of future bass that was popular with the big explosion of the EDM label Monstercat. I don't really think I have any songs of my own to use as an example, but this style was popular for its heavy yet bright synth pads and was also characterized with obvious synth leads, sometimes made by using their own sound waves, sometimes made by playing vocals like synthesizers. The drum patterns for these songs vary widely, but one usually common thing was that the LFO tool wasn't usually the main selling point of the track. In fact, a lot of the time it would be the vocals, if the song had any, and if not, the songs would usually have a bit of resemblance with some melodic dubstep, and probably influenced Kawaii future bass, which we'll get into in a bit.
for you.
This next style is pretty specific, but is still a notable style that I like to call futuristic bass, or more simply, the Grant Bowtie style. This style I wanted to cover in its own video, but I decided to scrap the idea in favor of this one. Essentially, this style, which I most closely associate with Grant Bowtie, is an up-tempo feeling style that places a heavy emphasis on percussive elements and sound effects. It features intricate synth and vocal stabs that work in a pattern with the drums, which may also be a little unorthodox on first listen. But what really drives this style home is the little fills and the sound effects that give the song life and some ambience. These sounds could be as random as coins falling, keys shaking, or white noise run through an ascending LFO. I particularly like this style because it feels energetic and somehow meshes a synthetic mechanical feel with an organic, bright, futuristic sort of sound. Like, to me, this style feels like a futuristic utopian city that perfectly mixes hovercraft and chrome and white buildings with the beauty of nature. I'm going to play some songs and put some images on screen and tell me you can't imagine these things with these songs over them. The next style is actually recognized as a completely different genre called Kawaii Future Bass, or shortened to Kawaii Bass, which is characterized by bright, bubbly synths, hard-hitting 808s, and anime and video game samples. This genre is particularly popular with gamers and the average otaku, and after listening to it, I'm sure you can figure out why. This genre also has the interesting quality of feeling nostalgic, even if you've never heard the song before. Synths are usually almost always written in major keys, but there are exceptions. And usually with these chords is a passing chord at the end of the phrase that goes out of key for a brief moment before resolving to the normal key. These synths can be stabby, wobbly, patty, or sound like every other LFO synth. This genre will also have these very adorable sounding synth leads, usually made with a basic sine wave and almost nothing else. The drums can have a very wide variety. Sometimes they're swung with the synths, but sometimes they can be sporadic and sound almost random. Drum patterns done in this fashion are usually used to accentuate the synths, along with whatever other random sound effects are thrown in. Whenever vocals are used, they are either cheesy or pitch shifted to sound cuter. Some really unique styles have developed within Kawaii Bass as well, but I'm lumping it all together because I don't feel like diving into Kawaii Bass styles. Just have some examples. Lastly, we have the style of future bass I like to call Flume, and it's because the songs are a little bit wonky. I covered wonk as a genre before in my EDM genres video, and forgot to mention that the genre could also be referred to as wonky. I figured it would be important to mention where it kinda stemmed from, being some of Flume's earlier work. This style really emphasizes detuned supersaws in conjunction with the LFO tool, and sometimes the low-pass filter to make some really interesting and euphoric synth pads. A technique which has become a major part of the wonky genre is called granular synthesis, which is basically when you run a sample through a granulation tool. It sounds complicated when I put it like that, but basically what it does is it chops up the sample thousands of times and plays them back randomly. These chops are referred to as grains, like grains of sand. You can control how random these grains are, as well as how harsh they are replayed, and where along the sample the computer decides to pull most of the grains from. When done correctly and with the right sounds, you can make some really euphoric pads and incorporate them on top of your synths for added texture. Though I should stress this technique wasn't generally used when this style was super popular. The drums are usually simple, but can sometimes be a little offbeat or maybe swung. This genre is played at some slower tempos, so it can make the song really sound impactful. Assisting these drums are other little drum fills, sometimes offbeat. Vocals have been incorporated and have become an important part of this genre, especially over the drop. I'd like to think that because of them, for a while, this genre was the most commercially viable EDM genre next to typical house music. When you put them together, you can really make some unique stuff. A little side note, this style sort of bleeds into yet another genre, sometimes referred to as future crunkwave.
I'm only human, can't you see? I made a mistake. Please just look me in my face. Tell me everything's okay, 'cause I got it. Ooh, never be like you. I'm only human, can't you see? I made a mistake. Please just.
And there we have it, a super long video about some of the most notable styles of my favorite genre. Hopefully this video was informative enough for you all to form an opinion of the genre, and I hope I've made some of you more aware of the genre and its intricacies. And also, for future reference, almost every genre in EDM can be broken down into styles like this. I don't know if I'll cover any more genres this extensively, but I felt this was needed because of how much I love this kind of music. Anyways, that's all for now. While we're on the topic of music, you can go check out my album, which is out now on all platforms. It would mean a lot to me. Thanks.